They say the Persians were refined, poets, mathematicians, and architects of empire. But beneath the domes of wisdom and justice, they boiled men alive. You hear it before you smell it. The sound of flesh peeling away from bone. The low gurgling of oil too thick for water and far too cruel for mercy. Bound in iron, stripped naked, a man is lowered inch by inch into a brass cauldron. His screens are muffled by bubbling fat. Above him, priests whisper prayers, not for his soul, but for order, obedience, empire. This was no spectacle for the common crowd, no Colosseum roars. These were punishments done in silence, behind walls, beneath palaces, for enemies too dangerous to kill cleanly. The message was simple: resist the will of the Shah, and you won't just die. You will become a warning carved into the air. Centuries later, legend has softened the edges. The Greeks called them barbarians. The Persians called it law. But what remains? Buried in half-translated scrolls and footnotes of forgotten historians, is a punishment so meticulously crafted it could only come from a civilization that understood both anatomy and fear. Today, we strip away the grandeur of empire and reveal the smell of boiling flesh beneath the throne. They carved the empire in stone, not for beauty, but permanence. Names etched into limestone, faces sculpted without pupils, eyes that never blink, never look away. The Achaemenid throne sat upon silence, and the silence was not peace. It was obedience. In Persepolis, light spilled like melted gold across carved reliefs. Columns rose like frozen hymns to the gods. Courtyards held air so still it pressed against the lungs. And in the royal chambers, sandalwood smoke curled upward. In thin, sacred lines, disguising the scent of fear, they called it justice. The Shahanshah, king of kings, did not rule by sword alone. He ruled by presence, by absence, by memory. He ruled through the men who whispered behind curtains and vanished before dawn, and through punishments that were never spoken aloud, only felt in missing suns, in locked doors, in dreams soaked with sweat. To serve the Persian king was to vanish into a clockwork of obedience. You bowed not just your head, but yourself. You removed your name, replaced it with function: eunuch, scribe, messenger, executioner. You walked on carpets woven with thread finer than air, and you learned to speak in glances, nods, breath, words. Became dangerous. This was not the chaos of tyranny. It was something colder, designed, a cruelty pressed into order, polished until it gleamed. Because when rebellion is treated as disease, it must be cauterized, quietly, without infection, beneath. The palaces, the prisons were soundproof. Not by accident. Stone corridors spiraled downward into airless cells where no scream could travel. A man might be kept alive for days after sentencing, fed salted dates and warm wine, not for kindness, but preparation. Flesh softens in wine, tendons loosen. The body betrays itself. The condemned rarely knew the charges. Sometimes there were no charges, just a glance, a letter, a pause in speech where the wrong word might have been. Dissent didn't require declaration. It only required possibility, and so cruelty became a kind of devotion, ritual. There were masters of pain who knew the precise temperature at which skin blistered but didn't break. They wrote nothing down. It was passed by hand, by gaze, by blood. Outside, the empire shone. Banners of crimson and indigo fluttered over fertile valleys. Silver coins bore the image of Darius, of Xerxes, kings who knelt only to the gods. Messengers rode from Lydia to Bactria in 7 days. The empire was efficient, merciful, fair, but beneath that image was heat and metal, and the slow hiss of water against brass. The Greeks called them tyrants. The Persians called them fathers, and both were wrong. The truth sat in the quiet gap. between language and power, in the spaces where breath slowed, where the condemned looked upward and found not rage, but precision. In the empire of fire and silence, cruelty was not madness. It was message. A body, broken the right way, could echo for generations. And when the cauldron was lit, it wasn't lit in fury. It was lit in order. Order, above all. And that order began not in violence, but in silence. It was not rage that brought the fire. It was doctrine, and doctrine does not scream. It whispers. In the Achaemenid courts, scrolls were unrolled with hands washed in rosewater. Royal judges wore white linen, the color of truth. Their fingers moved slowly, reverently over lines inked in vermilion, as if touching divine instructions. The man standing before them did not speak. He was not asked to. His fate had already been measured, not in guilt, but in impurity. Persians believed that fire was sacred, a living fragment of the divine. To corrupt it with a liar's breath, to defile it with the scent of a traitor's sweat, was to violate the world's balance. In the Zoroastrian order of things, evil was not chaos. It was dirt, and dirt could be burned away, so they gave the condemned to the fire, not always by flame, but by heat. Boiling was not a spectacle. It was purification. The sentence came in phrases polished by centuries. He has defiled the sanctity of truth, they said. He has brought shadow into light, not a man, a shadow. Something to be cleansed, not judged. A foreigner who spoke the wrong tongue. A wife who read the wrong book. A soldier who asked the wrong question. Sins were not weighed. They were dissolved. One judgment spoke of a man who harbored lies beneath his tongue. Another spoke of a priest whose hands touched flame unclean. No testimony, no trial. Just a decree sealed in gold, read aloud as if it had fallen from the sky. They did not call it death. They called it return. Return to dust. Return to silence. Return to purity. The cauldron, when prepared, was washed with blessed water from Mount Elborz. The brass was polished until it shone like the sun. The oil, sesame, mixed with salt and herbs, was chosen for its ability to carry scent, not to ease pain, but to carry the memory of the punishment outward, into the wind. And when the body was lowered in, it was not called pain. It was called separation, of spirit from flesh, of impurity from the divine. Those who performed the sentence wore veils over their mouths, not to hide themselves, but to avoid contaminating the sacred process with human breath. They did not look the condemned in the eyes. They did not flinch. To flinch was to betray the law. The man inside the cauldron was nameless. His name had been taken during sentencing, replaced with the word Drand, the lie-bearer. Once spoken, that word erased all others. No prayers could be said for him. No one could weep aloud. Grief was impurity. The fire must remain clean, but fire remembers. It remembers the tightening of skin as it shrinks from the bone. It remembers the moment breath turns to bubbles and screams drown beneath them. It remembers when silence stops being obedience and becomes absence. They wrote the sentences in careful lines, not to explain, to justify, to remind, so that future judges would not hesitate, so that execution would feel like law, not vengeance. This was not madness. It was scripture, not punishment. Sacrifice, and long after the oil cooled, the scent clung to the walls. Thick, sharp, a memory of flesh unmade. They scrubbed it with crushed herbs, burned incense to mask it. Still, it lingered, because the law did not forget. And when the next name was erased, and the next brass pot was filled, they would say again, not with fury, but with faith, let impurity be separated by fire. He did not look like a monster. He looked like silence. His robes were plain, but spotless. no blood, ever. The stains lived elsewhere, beneath the skin, behind the eyes. His hands were steady, clean-shaven, oiled with almond paste to avoid dryness. Even his breath was measured, as if each exhale had been taught. Because it had, they called them Averdinai Marg, the chosen of death. They were not recruited. They were selected, found as boys, watched, taken, taught not just how to kill, but how to unmake. Their first lesson was not in pain. It was in stillness, a year in silence, a year in shadow, a year without mirrors, without names, without voice. They were trained. Inside a compound deep in the Zagros foothills, its name never written, its path unmarked. They were stripped of lineage. Their hair was shaved. Their fathers, if still alive, were warned. Speak of your son again, and your family ends with you. The training was sacred. They studied anatomy not from drawings, but from prisoners. Every tendon memorized, every nerve tested. Pain was mapped like a science. The instructors used fire not as punishment, but as a question. What breaks first, skin or will? When they were ready, they were given tools, not swords, not whips. Implements crafted in secret workshops, copper tubes for burning oils, carved restraints for joint dislocation, brass ladles shaped for pouring precisely, instruments designed not to kill, but to maintain life through the longest suffering, and they learned how to breathe. They were taught to never grunt, never shout, never show satisfaction or struggle. A true executioner, they were told, is invisible. He is not a man. He is a threshold. When the condemned was brought forward, the executioner bowed, not to the prisoner, but to the flame. He touched his forehead to the floor, not in submission, but recognition that this act was not violence. It was purification. And then he began slowly. Always slowly, the body was a sequence. Each step measured by breath. The goal was not agony. Agony was clumsy. The goal was revelation. Strip the flesh, and truth would rise from underneath. If the prisoner begged, it meant the soul was still resisting. If they went silent, the fire had reached it. They did not question orders. They were told who to break, and they broke. Nobles, dissenters, priests, sometimes women. Once a child, he was 10. The executioner was told the boy had cursed the Shah in a dream. He did not believe it. He did not ask. He prepared the cauldron with care, as he had done 100 times before. But when the child looked at him, really looked, something cracked. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. You are not a shadow. You are. A man that night, the executioner broke his first rule. He wept, alone, face turned from the fire. Silent sobs caught in the back of his throat like splinters. No one saw, but the walls did. And the scent of the boy's skin, scorched almond and ash, would never leave them. Most executioners did not survive into old age. Their joints withered from the labor, their minds frayed from the weight. Some vanished into monastic silence. Others walked into the desert barefoot, never to return. One leaped from the palace roof during the spring festival. He left no note, only his tools, laid out with ceremonial precision, and a single flower placed where the child had once stood. They were not brutes. They were not beasts. They were men, trained to abandon the self in service of flame, and in that abandonment, they became something worse than monsters. They became obedience. The condemned died once. The executioner died every time. And still, when the next order came, they bowed, not because they wanted to, but because there was no longer anyone inside to refuse. They did not speak his name. Not once, not in the trial, not in the scroll, not in the courtyard where he stood, wrists bound with white linen, chest bare. eyes forward like a soldier walking into stormlight. Whatever name he had, whatever mother whispered it once beneath a fig tree, was already buried. In its place, a title. Traitor to the throne, he had been a satrap, a governor, a man of coin and pen, not blade, appointed by the court of Darius II to oversee the grain roads near Susa. He had written with care, balanced ledgers, sent tribute, and then, one spring, the carts stopped arriving. A letter was intercepted. Words inked in a trembling hand. The throne has lost the fire. It was enough. He was taken in the night. His servants disappeared. His wife remarried quickly. His sons were made scribes in distant provinces under new names. The silence came first, as always, and then the fire they brought into the execution court before dawn. The wind still smelled of crushed mint from the gardens. Marble stones chilled his feet. He did not shiver. He blinked once, slowly, as if memorizing the shape of the sky. The cauldron had been prepared hours earlier. It sat on an iron frame, low. To the ground, wide as a grave. The brass gleamed dark in the dim light, its rim worn smooth from years of breathless service. Beneath it, a pit of coals crackled, orange, black, alive. The oil had reached temperature. They knew this not by science, but by scent. When it smelled like roasted sesame and old sweat, it was ready. The executioners moved like priests. One stepped forward, face covered by a silken veil, and anointed the condemned's forehead with water, not to bless him, but to clean him, so the fire would not be defiled. Another oiled his wrists with jasmine, so they would not tear too soon. Their gestures were gentle, almost loving. That made it worse. He did not cry out when they brought him to the rim, but he looked once to the crowd, and there, in the third row, stood a boy no older than 10. Alone, watching, his knees buckled, they bound his arms behind his back, wrapped a thin cloth over his mouth, not to silence him, but to slow the choking when the oil rose. Then they lifted him. First, the feet. The oil hissed. Skin split. Nails blackened. The sound was not a scream, but a whisper of meat meeting heat. He arched instinctively. His spine curled, body flailing against the restraints. The executioners adjusted their grip, lowered him to the shins. The screaming began. It did not stop. Not for several minutes. Not until the oil reached the thighs. At that depth, nerves began to die. Voice became breath. And breath eventually became bubbles. They never rushed. They kept him alive as long as the flesh allowed. His eyes bulged, lidless. His jaw clenched until a tooth cracked. His head jerked in sharp, animal spasms. But the body always betrays itself. Somewhere near the ribs, the fight leaves. Somewhere near the heart, something else rises. Not surrender, not peace. Something hollow. Something beyond. They watched for that moment. When it came, they stopped, pulled the body, or what was left, from the oil. Limbs curled unnaturally. Skin sloughed like wet cloth. The face, once known, had become a mask of molten shapes. The cloth around his mouth was gone, but the silence remained. The boy who had watched was not seen again. Some say he was a servant. Others, a noble's bastard. A warning, a witness, perhaps even a son. It didn't matter. He had seen, and in that courtyard, where the scent of jasmine met scorched hair and boiling fat, history curled in on itself. Not his story, but his echo. Because the oil doesn't forget, it remembers the weight of rebellion, the scent of fear, the last breath rising like steam, the silence of the crowd, and deep inside the brass, if you listen long enough, you'll swear you still hear it. A scream that never ends, a scream without name, a scream that smells like burnt silk, and obedience. And long after the fire died, and the coals turned gray, and the body was removed. The oil was strained, cleaned, poured back into its vessel. Waiting. For the next, the stones never speak aloud, but they remember. They remember the weight of footsteps that never returned. They remember the pause between screams, the kind that hangs in air long after a throat is gone. They remember names, and how those names disappeared. In Persepolis, the walls were carved with perfect symmetry, kings with curled beards, soldiers standing tall, slaves kneeling with open palms, but no one screamed, no one burned, no one boiled. The empire recorded what it wanted to be true, and what could not be polished into honor was cast into shadow. Executions left no chisel marks. No inscriptions described the cauldrons. No official decree ever detailed the temperature of oil. Even the men who ordered them signed only with the word righteousness, but erasure is not silence. The Greeks spoke of it, quietly, then louder, then with fever. Herodotus wrote of Persian punishments as something monstrous, inhuman. He wrote of a man named Cytisps, a noble condemned not by sword, but by boiling brass. The Persian records made no mention, only a burial with no body. Even the courtiers whispered. In corners, behind drapes, beside fountains meant to mask breath and voice. They spoke of the Shah's oil, of the pit beneath the palace, of the executioners who never grew old, but no one wrote it down. The women knew. They heard it in the washing rooms, when the linens came back stained in ways no soap could lift. They knew which eunuchs would not meet their gaze. They saw the trembling in men too proud to tremble, and still the stories remained fragments. A letter found years later, buried beneath stone, written in hurried old Persian. He confessed, before the heat reached his chest. A merchant's tale from Lydia, of a brother who vanished during a tribute journey, last seen outside the palace kitchen. A lullaby once sung in Babylon. Don't speak too loud or fire will drink you. But the official scrolls remained. Clean history written by order, not by memory. What the empire could not erase with fire, it buried with marble. It filled its chronicles with victories and lineages, and cities built from dust. It turned punishment into silence, and silence into virtue. And the names of the broken were never spoken again, but the cracks remained. A carving in Susa, once thought to be decorative, showed a basin large enough for a man. A priest claimed it was ceremonial. A servant claimed otherwise. He remembered the scent. He remembered his cousin who never returned from a minor crime, and how his mother stopped cooking with oil afterward. Time passed. Stones wore down. Words blurred. Empires fell, and still the scream lingered, not in books, but in air. Even centuries later, in hushed academic halls and dig sites scorched by sun, there were murmurs of something done beneath the throne, of punishments too severe to be written in script, only hinted in shadow. Because some truths rot when touched by daylight, some must be heard only in the dark, in the space between stone and echo, in the breath just before denial. The Persians remembered without remembering, and the whisper never stopped. It's there. In the pause between inscriptions, in the silence of statues, in the line Herodotus skipped, in the boy's eyes before the cauldron. You will not find it in archives. But if you walk the palace ruins alone, long after sundown, you might still feel it. A heat beneath the floor, a voice beneath the wind. And if you listen closely, not with ears, but with grief, the stone will whisper back. There is a moment, just after the oil cools, just before the crowd exhales, when silence becomes strategy. In that moment, something ancient stirs. Not rage, not grief, something colder, something older than mercy, the knowledge that terror, if crafted properly, can outlive kingdoms. Persia was not alone. Long before its cauldrons, Assyrian kings carved warnings in stone, reliefs of impaled bodies left to rot under eagle's shadow. They wrote their sentences in blood, not ink. I flayed his skin and nailed it to the gates, boasted Achaemenid. No apology, no metaphor, just record. Further west in Rome, boiling was not whispered, it was performed. A Christian named John was said to have survived being lowered into burning oil. The miracle was not survival, it was the spectacle. The message, your gods cannot save you. Byzantium inherited the theater. Heraclius boiled 2 Armenian nobles in pitch, not for justice, for precedent. Their screams were meant to echo across provinces. Cruelty wasn't hidden. It was choreographed, and yet Persia's cruelty remained veiled because it did not need applause. It needed memory. It needed silence. In the shadow of Zoroaster's flame, punishment was never entertainment. It was order, a theology of precision. Where other empires burned to provoke, Persia boiled to cleanse. The cauldron was not a tool. It was a ritual, a mirror held to rebellion. They understood something deeper than dominance. They understood. Erosion, break a body, and you win a moment. Break a mind, and you win a century. The Persians buried their violence in elegance. No mobs, no stadiums. Just polished brass, jasmine oil, and a scream so muffled it became philosophy. That's what made it worse, because cruelty dressed in chaos can be blamed on madness. But cruelty dressed in grace, cruelty performed by men who do not tremble, that is strategy. That is empire, and empire always requires forgetting. Rome forgot the cries of its slaves. Assyria forgot the names of its flayed. Persia forgot the children who watched their fathers dissolve, but the fire did not forget. Moved quietly, from cauldron to stake, from stake to cell, from cell to courtroom. It changed forms, not to vanish, but to survive, to adapt, to wait. It understood that the body is not the only thing that burns. Faith burns. Loyalty burns. Identity, when pressed long enough under flame, curls like parchment, and still. Empires called it justice even. Now, if you walk the ruins of Persepolis, you'll find no trace of the furnace. Just perfection, geometry, the illusion of mercy carved in stone. But elsewhere, in ruined Roman arenas, in Assyrian stele, in Byzantine chronicles, the echoes remain. They tell the same story again and again. When kings feel threatened, they do not shout, they whisper. And then they burn, because to rule without love, one must rule through awe. And awe requires ritual, so they built the fire beneath thee. Palace, they called it necessary. They called it holy, but the oil never cared. It boiled every man the same. And in the end, every empire that touched it left behind the same scar. A name erased, a body unburied, a silence that still smells of smoke. The fire has gone out. The brass is cold now. The courtyard empty. The oil drained. The screams faded. No scent remains, only stone. Polished, silent, clean. Time buries what the conscience cannot hold. We speak of Persia now with reverence. The arches, the roads, the libraries. We call it civilized. We praise its wisdom. We marvel at its survival. We forget what that survival demanded, because mercy is never remembered as urgently as order. The scrolls spoke of righteousness. The kings wore rings that sealed death in the name of justice. And the people, the ones who bowed, who obeyed, who watched, they learned not to ask if it was right, only if it was legal, and legality always found a way to bless the flame. So they burned, and we forgot, but memory is not always voluntary. Sometimes it returns in quiet forms, in mirrored rituals. In words we still use order, purity. Necessary, we have not moved so far. We still make the fires clean. We still use oil, just differently. We still divide by category, justify with reason, sterilize with language. We still ask what the condemned did wrong before we dare to mourn them. Even now, in courtrooms built from white stone, in halls cooled by artificial air, we believe we are better, kinder, just. We call it process, reform, due cause, but we forget to ask, what will the stones say about us? What do we boil now that cannot scream? Whose names are we erasing with pen instead of fire? What punishment, clean, quiet, procedural, will one day be described by future mouths as unimaginable? There is no empire that lasts forever, but cruelty survives in its ashes, not as brutality, but as habit, as silence. We inherited the fire not through violence, but through comfort. We stopped needing mercy the moment we began calling everything justice, and somewhere, deep below the polished floors of every palace, every institution, every chamber dressed in robes and ritual, something ancient waits. Not as a cauldron, not as a flame, as a question. What if the only thing that made the boiling cauldron monstrous was that it told the truth about who we were? And what if the mercy we forgot to want was the one thing that could have stopped us from becoming them?